What I think is problematic here that I've seen over and over again is what we're not talking about. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. My name is, of course, Michael Granado. I'm a history and philosophy educator, and today we're going to return to one of my favorite subjects, and that's talking about the history of science and its relationship with the history of Christianity. In this video, I'm going to be reviewing an interview by the author Tom Holland. Tom Holland released a book about 5-ish years ago called Dominion, The Christian Origins of the Western Mind, or something like that, where Holland is arguing that the main features of Western society and culture stem from and are rooted in Christianity. And in this video specifically, which happened on the channel Capturing Christianity, Holland is going to be making the argument that science, as a feature of the Western world, as an institution that developed in the West, modern science, has its roots, origins, basis in Christianity, which is, of course, a topic that I've covered in various different ways on this channel. So I wanted to tackle it with respect to Holland. Eventually, I do need to read this book. This is a very popular book. It's oftentimes referenced by a lot of the apologists whose videos that I review who want to make the strong case that Christianity had a pivotal, if not primary, influence on the development of modern science. Holland is a little bit more nuanced than some of the other videos that I have reviewed, but I think it'll be interesting to explore that dynamic here in this conversation. I also want to apologize ahead of time for my voice. Not that my voice usually sounds better than it does right now, but I am getting over a little bit of cold, so I might sound a little nasally. Apologies ahead of time for that. But I'm going to let Holland speak for himself. And like I said before, he's going to be talking about how Christianity served as the basis for modern science. But we also get a really interesting discussion, I think, of a little bit of historical methodology and historical anachronism. But I'm going to stop talking and let Holland talk.
So I want to get into the topic of science, and we'll get to secularism in just a second. But so what is your basic argument for the claim that science is rooted in Christianity or has Christian roots?
One of the things that made me want to write Dominion was the discovery that writing in English, there were so many words. If you imagine a word as a kind of sponge and you dip it into a bath, so many words in the English language have been dipped into the bath of Christianity, and they're absolutely saturated with it. And science is one of those words. Science, in the sense that we use it now, really only takes on the current signification in the second half of the 19th century. The category doesn't exist before that. So to talk about, Greek science or Chinese science or Egyptian science is completely anachronistic. It's like saying that Julius Caesar invaded and conquered France. You kind of get the point, but it's not accurate. So where does our modern idea of science?
Okay, we'll pause it there because I want to comment on what Holland said. Like with a lot of these videos, there's much that I agree with, much that I disagree with. So Holland begins by explaining that what we think of when we think of science, right? If I were to go around and ask people, what's the first thing that comes to mind when you think of science? Maybe you think of big, fancy research laboratories, grand experiments, mind-boggling mathematical theories, giant research universities, institutes, all of that. The kind of characteristic features of modern science aren't really solidified until the mid-19th century, which is surprisingly late for a lot of people when you study the history of science. But kind of broadly speaking, generally speaking, Holland's right. A lot of the institutions of science, you have like the Royal Society that's developed in the 17th century, which I'll kind of reference a little bit later in this video. But science, as we think about it, generally speaking, Holland's right, doesn't really come along until the 19th century. And his general point here is that we have to be careful. If we want to be true to history, we have to be careful when we use the word science. We have to be careful to understand that when we look at the ancient world, for example, ancient Greece, ancient China, ancient Egypt, that when we say ancient Chinese science, for example, we don't mean the exact same thing as when we say modern biology is a science. There's obviously some significant differences there. Now, the extent to which they are different, the extent to which, for example, Aristotle's biology is different from Darwin's biology may not be as straightforward as Holland is letting on here. There is a lot of nuance in that conversation and discussion, but generally speaking, I would agree with Holland that 19th, 20th century science is very different in some of its key features than ancient science. But all of this kind of begs the question, well, what are the characteristics of 19th, 20th century science, what we would call modern science, contemporary science? What are their key features? Holland doesn't really spend any time outlining what he thinks these characteristics are. I think it would be very helpful to the conversation if he did that to help to illustrate and strengthen his points. But that got me thinking of, well, what would I say are the key characteristics and features of 19th century science? And like with a lot of things in the history of science, this can be difficult to pinpoint, and there's going to be a lot of agreement, disagreement, and nuance in this conversation. It's hard to. Science is surprisingly difficult to define. Okay. Ask any philosopher of science to define science. It's not super straightforward. Science is weird. But here's what I would say. I would say that one of the characteristics of modern science would be empiricism, the emphasis on empirical data and supporting and building and constructing scientific theories. What I mean by empiricism, I mean that in the like early modern sense, that epistemological justification comes primarily from sensory experience or empirical evidence. You can read this, for example, in early modern thinkers like Francis Bacon and John Locke are the two classic examples of this. But you also see strong empirical tendencies emerge during the early modern period that come solidified by the 19th century that arise out of very practical concerns. What I'm thinking of here is the discovery of the New World, what we would call like the age of exploration, the discovery of the Americas, Europeans going to the Americas for the first time, kind of ignited what we would call like classification efforts and the development of new scientific fields such as modern botany and zoology, which subsequently revolutionized other previously existing scientific fields such as medicine. The emphasis on empiricism led to these monumental efforts of classification of all these different new plants and animals. And of course, Spanish scientists, for example, who first encountered the Aztecs and their medical gardens, a lot of that knowledge was borrowed. And the classification efforts were applied to these pre-existing fields, like I just said, fields such as medicine, to see what the different properties, the different medicinal properties of these new plants we were discovering were. And I call that empiricism because that's not to say that prior to the development of the scientific revolution, people weren't looking at plants, for example. Of course, ancient people were looking at plants, but I guess I'm really talking about it in terms of emphasis, but I don't want to get too bogged down. Let me go on to the next point. So I would say empiricism, experiments, the use of and the emphasis on experiments in order to justify theoretical knowledge. An experiment, of course, is a procedure that is carried out to either support or refute a hypothesis that's suggested. The use of experiment, you really see this, Bacon is the first to outline the use of experiment for the scientific method. You get early astronomical experiments from Galileo, optical experiments from Newton in the 17th century. And in the 18th and 19th century, you really see the rise and the development of sciences such as chemistry that are going to put very heavy emphasis on these experiments. But experiment kind of comes to the forefront, I would say, in the 17th, 18th century. So empiricism, experiment, I would also add what I call the use of mathematics or mathematicalization of the sciences. This is kind of difficult to explain. I kind of cover this in the Galileo video that I made, but beginning in the early scientific revolution, specifically in the Copernican revolution, the revolution that was happening in astronomy, what you really saw was a coming to the forefront of mathematics as a way to describe and explain the world And subsequently, by the 19th century, what you have is that the foundation of all of these different natural sciences are firmly rooted and based in mathematics. Even sciences that are heavily based on observation, categorization, sciences like biology eventually become mathematical in nature in the 20th century, for example. So mathematicalization, I would also add institutionalization. I don't know if that's a word, the establishment of scientific institutions. Now, you had this previously in the form of universities and houses of knowledge and libraries, but in the 17th and 18th century, specifically, you have the establishment of the Royal Society in England in 1660, for example, as well as the French Academy of Sciences in 1666. These were organizations that were devoted and dedicated to the study of science that would eventually develop into full-blown research societies. These happen at universities, but they're also privately funded. And one of the things that we see post-industrial revolution, when we get the merger of science and technology, is kind of private businesses funding this research, which leads me to my final characterization, which is industrialization slash, I guess I would call it capitalization, the marriage of science and capital, the marriage of science and money, because at the end of the day, somebody has to fund and support all of this research. Well, with modern science, one of the chief characteristics post-industrial revolution of 1750 is that the justification for this scientific research is going to be based in what sort of new technologies and new developments that can occur as a result. Like I said before, this happens within the context of the universities, but it also happens in securing private sources of fundings. And of course, this is still a characteristic of modern science and the universities and the grant-based systems and trying to receive funding for one's experiments. This is heavily predicated on the practical application of the science that you're investigating. Now, that might sound a little cynical, but that's just practically speaking kind of how it works. But yeah, Holland doesn't give any sort of characteristics of modern science, which I think is a bit unfortunate, because he's going to go on to explain what he thinks are the roots of modern science. Now, I want to point out that with those characteristics that I do see as kind of fundamental to 19th and 20th century science, you get shades of that in the ancient world. None of the stuff that you see in modern science, none of those characteristics I mentioned, or if you were to add some other characteristic that you think is a hallmark of modern science, you're always going to have kind of precursors to that in the ancient and in the medieval world. Whether or not it's anachronistic is an interesting topic. And one of the big reasons why I wanted to make this video is this kind of shift that Holland's going to do. So he starts off by saying that modern science is different from, we can't apply the category of modern science to the ancient world. We can't say that the science of the 19th century is the same as the science of ancient Greece and ancient China. Based off of all of those characteristics I just outlined, that is partly true. But what I want to emphasize here is that it's not completely true in the sense that you can see aspects of these features in the ancient world. It's not like it just emerged out of nothing. There are shades of this that are happening in these ancient and medieval cultures. But let's go back to Holland, because I've been rambling on for quite a bit now.
Come from? Well, it clearly, again, it's all about evolution. And it surprises me that say evolutionary biologists are so often hostile to the idea that they themselves might be descended from a very contingent series of beliefs. The sciences, it means knowing in Latin. You can trace the evolution of what we call science back through the Enlightenment, back through the early modern period to the Middle Ages. And essentially, the study of science begins in the medieval universities. And the universities are very novel institutions when they're founded in the 12th century. And they are committed to the idea that God's law can be fathomed. So you have all kinds of lawyers who are fashioning what comes to be called canon law. But at the same time, you have people who apply the assumption that if God has given laws and it's structured then to human beings, then he must also have structured the cosmos with laws. So there is a single source, a single origin point for the laws that govern the cosmos. And human beings can hope to fathom these laws because the evidence of scripture is that God is willing to submit himself to the idea of covenants. So there's the covenant that the children of Israel have with God, and then there's the second covenant that is that St. Paul announces. So although scholars in the medieval universities are of course entirely content to acknowledge that miracles are possible, that nothing is beyond God, that he can suspend the laws of the cosmos if he wants, nevertheless there is this kind of guiding assumption that an all-powerful God has nevertheless allowed the cosmos to be structured by laws, and therefore it's possible, because human beings are created in the image of God and therefore have been endowed with the spark of divine reason, it's possible for them to fathom these laws. And that is the kind of ideological framework within which scholars in the Middle Ages look at the what they call natural philosophy, the functioning of animals, of minerals, of the cosmos, of the stars, the planets, and so on. And it's this tradition that then feeds into what is conventionally called the scientific revolution of the late 16th, 17th century. But I think, for reasons I've explained, that's an anachronistic term, and then feeds in ultimately into the 19th century. At which point science...
Okay, so Holland, in his account of the history of science, kind of relates it to an evolutionary perspective, that science kind of evolved from the Christian Middle Ages up to the early scientific revolution and then into the 19th century, that we can trace science back through the Enlightenment to the modern period and firmly place it, the beginnings of it, within Christian Europe. Ages. Holland says it begins in the universities in 12th century Europe, and specifically, and this is something that I've heard from John Lennox, for example, that the reason that we can trace it to the 12th century medieval universities and theological thinkers is the idea that these people were committed to the idea that God's law can be fathomed, that we can know and understand God's law and God's purpose, and that humans can hope to fathom God's law because God is willing to submit. This is Holland's language, because God is willing to submit himself to a covenant. He's willing to enter into this contractual agreement that human beings can comprehend. And as a result, Holland says we can apply the assumption that the cosmos is structured with laws, and that we can know and understand these laws that originate from a single point of origin, God, and that this is the framework for the natural philosophy of the Middle Ages. So I'm not really opposed to the general idea that Holland is presenting so far. I think he's right, again, in a very general sense, that medieval Europe and the medieval church / university system is without a doubt an influence on the development, for example, of the scientific revolution. I don't really see that as too controversial of a claim to say that the intellectual tradition of medieval European Christianity and its universities influenced the development of modern science in Europe is, I think, equivalent to saying that that Olmec astronomy influenced the development and the origins of Mayan astronomy, or that British political philosophy influenced the political philosophy of the early American Revolution. There's definitely an overlap, and there's definitely a point of origin in that regard. And there is, I think, a sense in which these things ought to naturally flow from one another or be connected to each other, simply because they share a geographical proximity to one another, and because they're occurring temporally, historically speaking, close to each other in terms of the time periods in which they're happening. The scientific revolution occurs in the same spatial, geographical location that medieval Christianity once occupied. So yes, there's going to be some natural influence and overlap between the two. And that's the part that I would generally agree with. But of course, the entire reason why I'm making this video is to talk about what I necessarily don't agree with. And so what I think is problematic here that I've seen over and over again is what we're not talking about. The facts, the historical facts that we're leaving out of this narrative. And this sort of interesting dichotomy, because Holland starts off talking about anachronism. He starts off talking about how 19th century science is categorically different from the science of ancient Greece and ancient China, but then proceeds to tell us that its origins come from medieval Europe. So my big question here would be, why are we stopping in medieval Europe? Why is that where we're beginning, and why are we not considering other sources of information? Why is that where this narrative begins? And Holland never justifies that point at all. Part of this lack of justification, I think, stems from what I mentioned at the beginning of this video, is that Holland never actually clarifies what is distinctive about 19th century science. And so again, I'm not opposed to the claim that 19th century science was influenced by or took inspiration from medieval science. But if you're going to say that medieval science is the origin of 19th century science, one of the things I would like to see explored is what exactly makes medieval science different and distinct from the other forms of science, knowledge collection about the natural world, that we see in other geographical locations that had potentially as big of an influence on the development of early modern science. The sort of science that's happening in medieval Europe is just as different from 19th century science as the sort of science that was happening, for example, during the Tang Dynasty in China, then how that is different from 19th century science. But it's not anachronistic to point out the fact that there are similarities between the two. This is exactly what Holland's doing. Even if we do want to make this separation between the science of ancient China and ancient Egypt, which Holland has provided no justification for. But even if we go along with what he's saying and say, okay, well, that is completely different, why are we not taking into consideration other medieval influences that would directly impact the scientific revolution? Why, for example, are we leaving out Islam and the Islamic Golden Age and the science that was happening during the Islamic Golden Age? I've made this point in other videos, specifically in the video that I made about Nicholas Copernicus, but you can make equally as strong a case that figures of the early scientific revolution, like Copernicus, were deeply impacted by Islamic astronomical thought. As I mentioned in that video, a lot of the mathematical framework that Copernicus is using is directly taken from those Islamic scientists of the Islamic Golden Age. But it's not only astronomy, it's also in medicine, and it's also in scientific methodology. So again, what is it about medieval science specifically? Because all Holland has cited are these kind of theological considerations, which again, I'm not denying had some sort of an impact, but to say that or to imply that it had a bigger impact, that these theological assumptions about natural law, for example, had a bigger impact on Copernicus than the mathematical models that he was using to build his theory, it needs a little bit more evidence. And lastly, what I want to point out here, why are we not taking into consideration non-intellectual influences on the development and origins of modern science? These are equally as important, historically speaking. Why, for example, are we not talking about what we would call like the age of exploration, the age of colonialism, in which we have the European discovery of the first time of the Americas? This is extremely significant, scientifically speaking, for a whole host of reasons. One, as I already mentioned, the discovery of completely new and different plants and animals that revolutionize fields like botany, zoology, medicine. But it's also with the discovery of the Americas that we have a direct challenge, for example, to Aristotelian geography, a literal opening up of the world and discovery of completely new, separate peoples, entire unknown civilizations that are discovered in a massive, huge landmass. All of this blew people's minds for obvious reasons. And like I said, deeply influenced and shaped, maybe not necessarily physics, but geology, medicine, botany, zoology, a whole host of other different scientific disciplines. And of course, maybe most importantly, are the political/financial developments that are happening in the 16th and 17th century. After all, we're not getting universities, we're not getting research institutions without funding. And the landscape of all of this changes radically post-industrial revolution. Anyway, I'll stop that video here. I'm not sure if it kind of made sense in my head. Let me know what you think about Holland's general point. Eventually, I do need to read Dominion to get a more detailed explanation of his argument. Maybe I'll do like a chapter review or something like that. But thanks for tuning in. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you think about what Holland said, about what I said. Are there any other characteristics that you would add to modern science that you think make it distinctive from what we see in the ancient world? Let me know, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.